The right to vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful, non-violent tool we have in a democratic society.
Indeed it is, which is why so many of us are committed to ensuring that right is preserved for everyone. The Supreme Court dealt a devastating blow to the 1965 Voting Rights Act when it essentially gutted the provision which requires certain states to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws. You know, things like decreasing the number of days for early voting or requiring a specific new voter ID. But there was some good news this week as a bipartisan, bicameral group of lawmakers, including Senator Patrick Leahy, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, and Congressman John Conyers, and of course civil rights icon John Lewis, unveiled legislation aimed at creating an updated solution to the issue of pre-clearance requirements. But while the bipartisan legislation unveiled on Thursday works to restore many of the vital protections lost in last year's court decision, many agree there's just more work to be done, describing it as a floor, not a ceiling, in fighting voter suppression. For starters, the new bill doesn't take into account the discriminatory impact of the myriad of restricted new voter ID laws that have cropped up across the country. Now, as we reported earlier, Friday saw another step forward for voting rights as a Pennsylvania judge struck down that state's restrictive voter ID law, saying it was unconstitutional. It was a huge victory for voting rights. But what if that ruling is appealed? The new federal law doesn't consider voter ID as an unconstitutional or a burden for voters. And just a few miles west, Ohio announced this week it'll join 26 other states in a controversial interstate voter registration cross-check program. Now, the program is the brainchild of Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. Remember him? He says the goal is merely to identify voters who are registered in more than one state to prevent the non-existent voter ID fraud. But opponents of the program point out that cross-check, as it's called, makes it too easy for legitimate voters to be falsely purged. So how will provisions in the new federal voting rights bill cover that kind of injustice? Joining me now, co-director of the Advancement Project, the legal team that delivered that stinging defeat for voting rights in Pennsylvania this week, Judith Browne Dianis, and founder and president of the Center for Social Inclusion, Maya Wiley. Thanks to you both for joining me, and congratulations, Judith. That was a huge win.
Thanks, Karen. Oh, huge win.
I want to talk about it in a moment, but starting with the new VRA legislation, and I want to talk about voter ID, but one of the things I want to make mention of, I believe it was in the statement that you put out, Judith, you talked about a known practice coverage formula, and you said that practices that have traditionally been known to discriminate against voters should have to be pre-cleared before going into effect. What would that look like?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Karen. You know, we know that there are certain kinds of tools that have been used as the tools of voter suppression. So, for example, if you have a growing minority population and you used to have single-member districts for you to vote in, and then you move to an at-large system, we know that moving of polling places can really hurt minority communities. And so what we're saying is there should be a provision where if a jurisdiction actually does one of these known tools, uses one of these known tools of voter suppression, and they have a significant number of minority voters, that it should be pre-cleared. Because, you know, we're letting too many jurisdictions off the hook by waiting around for them to have a certain number of judgments before the Department of Justice will get involved.
Right. You know, Maya, one of the things about this new legislation we were talking about is that it doesn't take into account voter ID. And voter ID laws, I think people think of traditionally as it disenfranchises predominantly African Americans and Latinos, but it's older people, it's rural people. I mean, it affects a broader swath of people than I think most realize.
That's right. And I think it's important to lift up that there is a major improvement in this bill, which is to allow for, in other words, if someone sues and wins under, like in Pennsylvania, on voter ID, that will count towards the count of number of violations for preclearance. So that's a good thing, and that's really important to recognize.
Right.
But that is the political rub in terms of making a really strong act that protects every American's right to vote is, are we actually going to say that no single political party can make it difficult for, say, women who got divorced and whose passport has their married name and whose driver's license has their maiden name.
Texas?
Like in Texas, maybe, can suddenly have a very hard time having the right to vote. And in North Carolina, you can't even file an affidavit now. So imagine what that does. That's over 53% of voters in North Carolina who are women.
And, you know, Judith, I guess it struck me that I supposedly, I guess the assumption was that voter ID would be handled, as in Pennsylvania, by organizations like yours, sort of at a state-to-state basis. But that, I think, presents a real challenge because obviously it's incredibly expensive. It means you've got to make choices about where you're going to try to file litigation and where you're going to fight that fight. But do you think that was the assumption?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, what's really difficult about this is that we really would have to take all of these cases to a judgment in a court. You know, often, Karen, we end up settling these voting rights cases. For example, I was counsel in the case against Katherine Harris in Florida in 2000. A number of civil rights organizations worked together, but we ended up settling that case. We know that Florida discriminated against African Americans in 2000. And guess what? Because we settled, because we came to a resolution, because we fixed the system, at least for a short time, you know, that doesn't count towards preclearance. And often that's how cases end up, is that we settle them. And it's unfortunate that those kinds of cases would not be involved. So places like Florida and North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, where this case came out of the Shelby case, would not be covered under this current formula.
You know, Maya, speaking of voter ID, Congressman Sensenbrenner said the following. He said, the modernized VRA is constitutional and bipartisan. It includes strong nationwide anti-discrimination protections and continues to permit states to enact reasonable voter ID laws. What's a reasonable voter ID law?
Well, the most reasonable one is the one that doesn't exist. But I would say certainly there are voter ID laws where there are many different forms of ways a voter can demonstrate that they are the person who is in the book, like a bill, a utility bill. And so there are many, many states that have these kinds of verification laws. And so obviously I think it's better to go back to the system that just acknowledges that we have a pretty good registration system and a very good criminal justice system that actually goes and prosecutes when we have a problem, and we, as we know, because we have a system that prosecutes, we don't have a voter fraud problem. We have a problem, though, with parties and candidates.
Yes.
So if we want to pass some laws to deal with that, then I think that's what where our time should be better placed.
You know, Judith, final question to you. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is we are seeing inventions of new ways to suppress the vote every day. So even talking about this legislation, and when you talked about, you know, a known practice coverage, I mean, what about things like cross-check, which is something I frankly just learned about this week, which is, you know, a way to essentially purge voters from the rolls, and other tactics that we know are out there that may not yet be known as a voter suppression tactic?
Well, I mean, here's the thing, is that under the Voting Rights Act, we'd still be able to bring those kinds of cases against Ohio. It's just that the Department of Justice wouldn't have an automatic check on whether or not those things were discriminatory. So, I mean, for those of us who do this litigation and for the Department of Justice, we're going to have to keep fighting it out. But at the end of the day, we know we need a strong Voting Rights Act. We need to make sure that voters of color are protected. We know that too often politicians are trying to manipulate the vote just for their own gain, and that we, you know, Election day is the one day when we're all equal. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black, white, Latino, or Asian. We all have the same amount of power when we enter that booth. And so we need a Voting Rights Act that makes sure that that is real.
Well, I hope both of you continue to keep up the good work. Congratulations again, Judith. Thank you, Maya Wiley and Judith Browne Dianis. All right, coming up, you're going to be shocked. Fox News gets it wrong again as the right wing goes after a new proposal from the Obama administration that's aimed at removing race from school discipline. More on that coming ahead.
While the teen pop star was not arrested, a rapper known as Lil Za, who was at Bieber's home during the police search, was taken into custody on a drug charge.
Boy, ain't that the American system of justice. Wow. How about that? Here's what happened. White guy breaks some, cops come and take the black guy away.